Okay, you ready to jump in? Psalm 73. Pull out your talk notes if you're a note taker especially. Some of the verses that I'll refer to won't be on the screen, but I did put them in the notes. I'm going to begin with a statement, an assertion, and I believe it couldn't be more biblical, and that is this: that you were created, that I was created to know God, to live for Him, the Bible will use the metaphor of walking with God through this one life that we have here on earth, to worship Him, to live for Him, to love Him, to know Him. We were made for such. And we talked about last week, and we've mentioned many times, and you know this maybe all too well. If you don't worship God, you will worship something, someone. You will find substitutes, because as we talked about last week, everyone worships. You're hardwired to devote yourself, to live for, to put your hope and trust, to find meaning and significance in something transcendent, something beyond yourself, something bigger than yourself. And so we referred to this non-Christian fellow in a commencement speech, David Foster Wallace, and I even put part of that speech in the talk notes for you, where he contended to this graduating class at a liberal arts college that, hey, I know you guys think you're sophisticated and modern, matured way beyond thinking that there's really some God that you need to surrender your life to or live for. You're way too smart for that. But let me just tell you something, everyone worships. And he goes on to say, and the reason for worshiping what would possibly be, and again, not someone who is a Jesus follower, the true God, you should look for that, because you will worship something. And in that speech, he'll say it might be physical prowess or beauty or sexual appeal. And with every wrinkle and gray hair, you will die 1,000 deaths. It will eat you alive, he said. Whatever it is, if you want to live to be the smartest guy, devote yourself, find meaning and significance, transcendence in being the smartest guy in the room. You'll always live. It'll eat you alive is how he said it. Because you'll always feel like a fraud, like you'll be discovered that you aren't nearly so well put together or as smart as you like for people to think. And so you will worship something. Augustine, who was a philosopher and theologian of the 4th century, said this because he was living, he liked the ladies. And it was difficult for him to give that up. But God finally chased him down. And then he would say these words: "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. I've looked in all the wrong places for it," he said. And finally, I found it in the only true place that can bear the weight of the human soul. It is because it's in worshiping Him, knowing Him, loving Him. It's in that we were made. And so David Foster Wallace said, be really careful. And even more importantly, as we saw last week, Jesus says to us in His Sermon on the Mount, be really careful. Man, you're going to be devoted. You're going to have, your heart is going to be connected. You are going to treasure, that's how he said it, treasure something. Be careful what you treasure, because what you treasure, that's where your heart will be. And so be really careful. And so the challenge is for us always is to consider, what do we, how did Jesus say it? Put your treasures in heaven, not just here on earth. It can't bear the weight of them. They're going to, you just invest your heart's devotion here in things that will not last. He says, don't do that. And you say, well, I wonder if I do that. And so there's a test that we've mentioned last week and beyond. You kind of just think about what you think about. What kind of thoughts does your mind most easily tend towards or move towards, or the use of your time and your money, those things that you sacrifice your time, energy, and money for, that you do so most effortlessly. Those tend to be the things that we treasure, that we look to for our meaning and significance, and we devote ourselves to. Or look at the things you worry about most, or the things you most fear losing. What is it? I mean, what are your deepest fears? What's your greatest fear? It can give you an indication of maybe what you're worshiping that is not worthy of your worship. I love what Tim Keller points out, and I don't know if it was him or his wife, but said, look at your painful emotions. Pull up your painful emotions by the root, and what you'll often discover is your idols dangling from the roots of those painful emotions. And so get worship right, and you're going to worship your Creator. Get it wrong, and you're going to worship something in creation. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul writes about when he writes to the Christians in Rome. And he says, people who know better, they refuse to worship God or to give him glory, is the way he says it. And on top of that, he says they refuse to express thanksgiving and gratitude because everything comes as a gift from God, that you have everything. And people know better, but they refuse to worship and love God most, or to give him thanks as the source of all earthly blessings. And then he says it like this: they exchange the glory, the weightiness of God. In fact, let's just read it. I'll have my associate put it on the screen for you. They exchange the truth about God for a lie. That's what they exchange for. Get worship wrong, and this is what you'll do. And they worship and serve what God had created instead of the Creator himself, who is to be praised forever. And so what we've talked about here, because we're talking about why church, and now we're talking about why worship is such an important part of being the church, of doing church, of gathering together. And it's, in a nutshell, I think, primarily best understood as just expressing love for God and gratitude and appreciation for God. We primarily think about it in terms, like we think about worship music or the worship band or the worship team. We tend to think about it primarily in terms of music or singing, but it encompasses far more than that. It really encompasses all of life. There's virtually no limit to the ways in which you can express appreciation and love and devotion to God. We do it with song and music, and that's quite a gift that God has given us. But to say, God, I love and I value more than anything else, can be done in every aspect of life. Paul would write about that when he writes to the Corinthians, and he says, whether you eat or you drink, or how does he say it? He says, I put it in your talk notes, if you do anything, you shall do everything for the glory of God. Whether it's changing a baby's diaper, or that sweet little wonderful gift from God that has become a three-nager. Anybody have any three-nagers in the house? I have a granddaughter who's become a three-nager. I go, wow, I guess I'll just keep loving this little munchkin to the glory of God, and we'll get through this season of life. Or maybe it's actually a teenager, not a three-nager. But all of those things and everything, we can do it to the glory of God and express our love and commitment to him. And so how we use our time, our energy, our money, how we treat the gal who's less than courteous at the check stand as we check out, how we forgive people, how we honor God's word, how we tell him thanks for all the many little things that we can so easily take for granted. Hebrews says this, I put it in your talk notes. Hebrews 13:15 says, then through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks. So that's what we want to focus here on this morning. This idea of actually verbalizing our praise, doing it as we gather together in song or hymns and just in our speak. But what I want to do is I want to start this part of the talk with a question. Think about the Bible and think about, like in the Bible, what's your favorite command? And some of you are thinking, go ahead, let's show them here what some of you are thinking. What you talking about, Willis? You're going to go, command? I don't associate the word command with the word favorite unless it's preceded by least. What's your least favorite command? Maybe I could think of something. But my favorite command? And if that's the way you think about that, then you will probably find it hard to relate with the psalmist who wrote the 119th Psalm. And it includes these words. These are just some random selections about about God's commands and what this author's thoughts are about them. In Psalm 119, verse 47, he says, I delight in your commands because I love them. I love you bossing me around. We tend to think of them as being like, obligations or burdens or just things we have to do, rather than God's invitation to experience kingdom life as it was meant to be lived. Even though it might grate against our sinful nature, our fallenness, our flesh, the truth is God, they're really an invitation of God to experience the good life, the with God life. And so he says, I delight in your commands because I love them more than gold, more than pure honey, more than pure gold, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Your statutes are wonderful. Your commands make me wiser than my enemies. So these are gifts from God, these commands. Your words give life. It gives understanding that I may live and truly live the good life, the with God life. And yet, we often think of them as obligations or burdens, and we should work on that because God is really trustworthy and wants our best interest. And so, how about this one? For if you can't think of a favorite command, I'll suggest one for you. Psalm 100 reads like this: Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the earth. Rob, this could be his favorite one because he says his singing sounds like noise. And after last week, my mic was on during worship, and I couldn't hear it in the room. The volume was sufficiently loud, but I heard it on the what do they still say? I heard it on the tape, even though they don't use tapes. Is they still saying that? I heard it on the recording, and I think like, gadzooks, So we didn't post that part. And Rob says, I love make a joyful noise because that's all I'm really capable of doing. And apparently anymore, it sounded like that for me as well. But make it joyful. Even if you can't sing on tune or singing isn't really your deal so much, the fruit of your lips giving thanks is pleasing to God and appropriate. And so he says, serve the Lord with gladness and come before his presence with singing. Have you ever noticed this? I don't know if you've ever really thought about this or not, but if you're familiar with the Bible, have you ever noticed how there's never a command in the Bible about making a whining noise unto the Lord, or a self-pitying complaint unto the Lord, or be cranky, be negative, be cynical? You ever noticed never commands us to do that? Because it didn't need to, and we shouldn't, but it comes pretty natural to the person that my wife Marcy is married to. So how many would admit, like me, that you really don't need a command to whine or to complain? Anybody else like me? You didn't really need any encouragement towards that. So how about just this week, thinking about your life? How many of you had a bad attitude this week about anything? So just, you had a bad attitude and you let it be known. And before you raise your hand, because it might be good to get it off your chest, because, they say confession is good for the soul. So I'll spur your thinking with a few categories here about maybe something you wrestled, some attitude, some negative attitude that you wrestled with this past week. So if you did any whining, if you did any kind of complaining, if you were cynical about anything, if you mishandled anger, or you felt superior to someone else, or resentful or envious of someone else's past week, how many of you would say, yeah, if I were honest? Okay, well, you guys are doing pretty good. Now, how many of you would say, yeah, but the person that I'm sitting next to, them not so much? How many of you would say, yeah, it's the person? Now, they're going to feel better if you do this. If you out them, they're not going to out themselves, but it's good for the soul. So how many? All right, let's move on. We were created to know God, to love God, to walk with him, to live for him, to make a joyful noise of thanksgiving, of praise to him. We were made for that. And maybe you've already mastered that, but if you haven't, then I just want to make a couple of observations here as we work through the 73rd Psalm. Maybe you would find what this fellow, Asaph, is struggling with, something you can identify with, because he is struggling with his attitude. And he's kind of at a place in his life where he's pretty sure life is ripping him off, that it's not fair what he's living through and experiencing. And so he writes this prayer. God in his goodness saved it and preserved it so we could read it because, well, we just might be able to relate. And so he begins like this in verse 1 of Psalm 73. Surely God is good to Israel, that is, to his covenant people, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet almost slipped. I nearly lost my footing, for I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Now he's saying, he starts off with like theologically, I mean, I get it. God is good, and he's good to those who are pure heart. I know that. At least in theory, I know that. But man, verse 2, he says, I kind of lost my confidence in that. I've kind of lost my footing here. I'm starting to wonder if God is really, really so good after all and can be trusted. And then he tells us the reason, because I looked around and there's just all these bad people. And things are going really, really well for them in life. And I'm going to be honest with you. That's why I love the Bible. You don't need to leave that up right now. But it's just so honest. It just pulls the curtain back on you and me and how often we struggle, just like this fellow here. They're really bad people. Life is going really well. And I'm none too happy about that, God. It makes me mad because it isn't fair. Verse 4, he continues. He says, they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. You know the type, right? The kind that make you puke. The Armani buying, spandex wearing, Jaguar driving, ab flattened, liposuction, beautiful people that just make you want to hurl, right? You know the type? He does. Asaph says, yeah, I do, and I don't like them. He says in verse 5, he says, they aren't troubled like other people or plagued with problems like everyone else. And so he says they're bad people, living a good life. And I can't make any sense of that. Their careers seem to be going well. Every time they post something, it's always some new vacation destination. They don't seem to have any of the financial issues or struggles that I deal with. They bought Bitcoin, 1,000 of them, when it was $72, and then they sold when it was $72. And they're really not good people. They're dirty rats, and yet they have it made in the shade. These are the people who sit courtside. You ever watch like a basketball game, and then some of these just God-hating celebrities sitting courtside, or they show them up in one of the owners' booths or the luxury boxes. Maybe you'll see a little bit of that today. So if things have been going well and you want to fall into the depths of despair and envy, you can watch the Super Bowl and pick out some people to hate. And then this passage of Scripture can come alive for you. Fortunately, it's not going to end there. So verse 6, he says, they wear pride like a jeweled necklace and clothe themselves with cruelty. These fat cats, this is a paraphrase here, these fat cats have everything their hearts could wish for. Literally, that Hebrew is, and I think this is from like the King James translation, the Old English, it says, their eyes bulge with fatness. These fat heads, these fat cats living high on the hog, getting seemingly everything they want, and all the while, verse 9, he says they speak evil of God in heaven and give arrogant orders to everyone on earth. These people go about life writing their own script. They think they've got it all figured out, and why wouldn't they? I mean, life seems to be going swimmingly for them. Everything they touch turns to gold. Why wouldn't they think just that? Verse 10, he says, therefore people actually turned to them. If that wasn't annoying enough, people actually looked at these people and listened to all their words. Because of their money, because of their power and position and status, people will turn a blind eye towards their character defects, and they'll look to them as role models and think, man, I wish I could be like that. He says they hang on every word. Verse 11, and you can just see he's kind of in a death spiral here as he just thinks about poor old pitiful me. They say, how can God know? Does the Most High have knowledge? And the thing I don't get, he says, is that they just openly mock God, and he appears to do nothing, just lets it go on and on. He's doing nothing about it. Verse 12, look at these wicked people enjoying the life of ease while their riches multiply. And if it weren't bad enough that things are going well for bad people, I'm not a bad people. Things aren't going so well for me. Man, I've tried to be really good. Verse 13, he says, for what? Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? Did I keep myself innocent for no reason? Like, where's the payoff for me? It seems to be paying off. A bad life seems to be paying off for them. How about me? I mean, I go to church. I don't just go to church. I serve in church. I don't just come and sit and listen and leave. I actually do stuff for Jesus. And on top of that, I'm a regular percentage tither. I give the first part of my income towards the Lord's work here. I try to avoid gross sin. I'm a pretty darn good moral guy. I mean, for the most part. Certainly compared to most people. Certain compared to those people. And yet my days are full of struggle and problems and stress, and my nights, hamburger helper. And then look at them. Compared to them, verse 14, I get nothing but trouble all day long. Every morning brings me pain. This is in the Bible because God knows us and he cares about us. And this is so human nature. I don't know if you've ever felt this way, but if you do, it just means, welcome to the fallen human race. The Apostle Peter, Matthew will record this in his gospel, will ask Jesus, hey, we've left everything to follow you. We're in that group of really good people trying really hard. And what's in it for us? Now, Asaph in the 73rd Psalm has obviously spent way too much time on Facebook and also scrolling through Enneagram and comparing himself to the other more popular kids or to his co-workers who make more, who travel more, who do less. And it's not setting very well with him. I'm trying really hard, and I don't get the bigger house. I'm really trying to do the right thing, and you see the late model car I'm driving? Or how come we struggle with infertility? And look at those people, and they're on child 7, and they don't even love Jesus the way I do. And Asaph is feeling the weight of that, and it's like an acid bath. Have you ever taken one of those acid baths in a tub of covetousness and resentful envy? That's where Asaph finds himself. And he realizes it's eating him alive. And it's doing damage to his soul. And verse 15, he said, I try not to get cynical and say things out loud. Verse 15, he says, if I had spoken this way, I would have been a traitor to your people. He's saying, if I had become this whiny, complaining, cynical person and gave voice to that, I wouldn't have just done damage to my soul, and you know how that is? You have any friends that are kind of toxic in that way? They just always giving voice to something cynical and negative, and that stuff's infectious. And he's saying, I feel that, but man, I've been biting my tongue, and that's not been so easy to do. But I know that if I hadn't, I would be disloyal to everything that I claim to value and believe, and I wouldn't have just undermined my faith, but the faith of others. And so, verse 16, he says, so I tried to understand why the wicked prosper, but it was a difficult task. And that's why probably the most voiced doubt about God being all-powerful and good is, how come bad things happen to good people? How can God be so good in a world that's filled with so much pain and heartache and struggle and sin and evil? He says, man, I've tried to understand why the wicked seem to get away with it, but it's a difficult task indeed. I tried to make sense of it, but it's not easy. And it isn't an easy question to answer. And he said, I find myself kind of like spiritually hanging by a thread here. And he doesn't want to give in. He doesn't want to let go. But he says, man, my feet almost slipped. Man, I'm losing my grip here. The unfairness of life, my envy and unhappiness is overwhelming me, driving me to despair. But we come to a turning point. He did something. Maybe it wasn't easy for him to do, not in light of, the psychological and emotional and spiritual, quandary he finds himself in. But he says, until verse 17, I entered the sanctuary of God. And then I saw the whole picture, which is a paraphrase. But it's a paraphrase of what he actually says here. Then I understood their final destiny. All those happy, shiny people aren't nearly so happy and shiny, and they're drinking out of a well that holds no water. And that's going to come back and it's going to bite them, and it's going to bite them terribly. And I lost sight of that. Because of that, I found myself envying them. And in other words, he's saying, I was thinking my thoughts actually reflected reality until I got together with God's people and I turned my focus onto him and off of me. And then I realized I wasn't seeing things clearly at all after all. My thoughts didn't reflect reality until I actually lifted my eyes and my heart to heaven and began to worship. It was only then, gathered with God's people, that my senses returned to me as my focus turned to God. And so through the course of our short little series here on Why Church, a refrain has been the Hebrews 10 verse where it says, so don't forsake the assembling of yourself together, because you're going to find yourself kind of caught on that same little rat wheel going round and round, exhausting yourself spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. And it's going to be real easy to say, man, I'm just not going to do the church thing now. I'm going to take a little break. But what you'll find is that you can sink deeper and deeper into that pit. And so he said, man, I went to church. It wasn't easy. I did it. Hebrews says, man, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. It's the habit of son. It's easy to do, but it's, like we said, it's an easy habit to get into, but it's a hard one to get out of. And so he says, when I got the focus off of me, it's amazing the difference that it actually made in my life. My problems, my stress, my agenda that I was so focused on, the things began to look altogether different when I put my focus on God and not on all of those things. In other words, when I bowed my heart in worship and thanksgiving and in reverence to the God who really is in control and the God who really does keep perfect score. And like Jesus would say when Peter said, hey, what's in it for us? He goes, trust me. God will never be your debtor. Okay? You will sacrifice nothing for the Lord that he doesn't return in spades. It doesn't say that. I think it's 100 or 1,000 times more. And so he says, when I actually worship, man, nothing in my life actually changed, but everything in my life actually changed. Because my attitude changed, how I saw things changed, how I viewed people changed, and it changed everything. In verse 23, he says, yet I'm always with you. It's like, I thought like, man, I'm just spinning my wheels here, but I realized when I came to a place of worship and lifted my attention towards you, he said, I always have you with me. You've never let me down. You hold my right hand. You never leave or forsake me. You guide me with your counsel. And afterwards, after this short little life, after this brief little life that we're all just given as a gift, that is like a vapor, the Bible says. It says, he'll take me into glory. And that'll be my ultimate destiny. And you know, everything in my life didn't change right now, but everything in my life changed right now when my focus changed and I worshiped. And he says, as for those I envied, verse 17 through 20, you can read it on your own, but he says, I realize they're on a slippery road. And in the blink of the eye, everything that seems so secure and valuable will be gone. The greedy CEO with the golden parachute, the arrogant neighbor who appears so invincible, that self-reliant Pacific Northwesterner who has little interest or need for God, who seems so unfazed, hot lips Houlihan at the office who seems to get every advantage. Asaph says, I realize that like Jesus said, there's a broad road, but it doesn't lead to where you want to end up. It's a slippery slope. And that they too will hit a patch in their life where a report comes back from the lab, and it's not good news. Or somebody runs a stoplight and they realize I'm not so bulletproof. Or the industry they're in fails, or the economic bubble that they've been so blessed by pops, and they find themselves with you in the unemployment line, except for not there with the God who has you by the hand. One day, he says, these people actually come home to a home that's empty because the people that should have mattered most to them didn't, because everyone worships, everyone treasures something. And you can treasure wrongly, and if you do, you will chase after that which is not gold. And so the psalmist in verse 22 confesses, man, I was foolish, I was ignorant, man, I was like a senseless animal. And so I would agree in large part with what Andrew said a couple of weeks ago when he said, he finds it very troubling when people say things like, hey, man, worship was really good today. Or, man, I really enjoyed worship today. Because ultimately it's not about you. I mean, if you're singing to God, it's ultimately about him, right? And that's true. It is about God. But you know what I also recognize to be true? Because God is so good when we worship, something happens to us as well. And I'm just going to give you a couple of observations here, just as we wrap this up, about what I think happens in worship. And we see it here in his life. He said, until I went to the sanctuary, and so the first fill in your blank in your notes, if you're working out of them, is in worship I gain perspective. I mean, it's not about me in worship, but in turning my attention to God, it's like things become more clear to me and about life and about what really matters. I went to the sanctuary and it dawned on me. I was reminded as we lifted up our voices, as sacrifices were made to the only true and living God, that apart from him, life is really a disastrous proposition. And I'm beginning to see more clearly. Maybe a little bit like, and it's been a while ago now, but this college gal wrote home to her parents this letter. She said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I have so much to tell you." So they're footing the college bill. She's off at college. "I have so much to tell you because the fire in my room set off by the student riots. I experienced temporary lung damage and had to spend some time in the hospital. While I was there, I fell in love with an orderly and we moved in together. I dropped out of school and I found out that I was pregnant, and he got fired because of his drinking. So we're going to move to Alaska where we might get married after the birth of the baby. Your loving daughter." Oh, P.S., he says, none of that really happened, but I did flunk chemistry class, and I wanted you to keep it in perspective. And in worship, and so sometimes I say, man, worship was really good today. Well, why? Because, man, I lost perspective. I had my eyes on me, on worshiping me, and treasuring all the wrong things. And so when we worship, we get perspective. And of course, it's not what we do for perspective. We do it because God is worthy of it, no matter how we feel. What did Job say? He said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Yet will I keep my hope in him. And it's not just about my circumstances, and it's not about me, it's about him. It's not about getting something out of it. In fact, that worship requires that I don't come to God like that. I mean, that's what Asaph was doing, right? It was all about him, and then until I went to the sanctuary, and I got my eyes off of myself, and I focused my eyes and my heart on something bigger, infinitely bigger. And so I love that Bible verse in Psalm 34 that says, oh, magnify the Lord with me and let us exalt his name together. Let's do it together. Let's lift our voice together and magnify the Lord. And I've said this over the decades as I have read this verse and thought about it. It's like when you think about magnifying something, you're thinking about making it bigger than it really is. So come and let's think God's bigger and better and more trustworthy than he really is. That's not what he's saying, obviously, right? And so in my mind, I see the images of a telescope and of a microscope. And when I'm worshiping rightly, it's like I'm viewing God through a telescope, not making him bigger than he is, but seeing him more up close for how great and big he actually is. Come and magnify the Lord with me. Let's lift up our voices together because God is big and he's good and he's eternal. And if you don't, you're going to lay your treasures up in things that will not last, that don't matter. And that's what Jesus' warning was that we looked at last week. And when you do that, it's like looking at things through a microscope. It's looking at insignificant things, things that don't matter, things that won't last, things that can't bear the weight of a soul through a microscope. And you go, whoa, that's big. That's worth giving my life to. No, it's not. Come magnify the Lord with me, because we get so easily swept up into a place, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, like Asaph. And we need to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together because we need perspective. All week long, we're just being bombarded with all sorts of solicitations to stare into the microscope and see the great and wonderful things that we should give our one heart's devotion to. And when we worship God, that's just contingent with reality. We see things for how they really are. We see the things for how they'll always be, eternal truth. And in so doing, we find our hearts filled with joy. We find ourselves, the things that matter start to matter. I didn't even more. I didn't even think about it in a positive way. But in Matthew 5, where Jesus said, if you're there, you've gathered together with the people of God and you're presenting your offering at the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, go and make it right and then come back and finish the worship service. And I just think it's like God's just saying, okay, Buster, don't you come crawling in here thinking things are okay with you and me. And maybe that's part of it. That's the way I've always thought about it. But until just the other day when I thought no, he's presenting his gift to the great God to whom we owe our all. And you realize, things aren't right with you and someone else. And if you saw it clearly, it's such a small thing. So let's go deal with that small thing in light of the big thing. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim. I get perspective. And verse 23 says, again, he says, I'm not always, he said, yet I'm always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel. And afterward, you're going to take me into glory. I know I'm not alone, that my forever is secure. When I worship, I find myself becoming more humble. I find myself wanting to do good. I get perspective. It changes my perspective on everything. And then the second thing here is that in worship, I find myself quite not even just indirectly, I find myself being able to diagnose my own heart, or maybe more aptly put, the Spirit of God diagnoses the condition of my heart. In verse 21, he says, then I realized when I went to the sanctuary, then I realized my heart was bitter, and I was all torn up inside, and I was so foolish and arrogant, I must have seemed like a senseless animal. He goes, here I am, I'm just turning my attention towards the Lord, and I realize, yeah, you're a jackass. It's like, Marcy and I, we used to walk around the neighborhood, and not as though we don't anymore. She does. But I'm going to start, like with this new year. That was, and maybe today will be my first time out in this new year. Most people are quitting by February. I wait to February to start. But in the long times ago days, we used to go for a walk, and we'd walk by this wood fence that was like maybe 4 foot tall. And just as you rounded the corner, it went to a 3 foot high chain link fence. And there was this nasty, mean dog there that would tear out after you with everything he was worth. And he was on like a cable and a chain. And so he'd run and run and run, and just short of getting to the fence, it'd go, get jerked back. Every time we walked, he did the same thing. And two thoughts occurred to me. I was like, that must hurt. And the other thing is, does he think, like, it's been 600 times now, does he think that's going to start working now all of a sudden? Is it really worth it? But fortunately, we're not like that dumb dog or Asaph, or maybe sometimes we are. I found myself, acting like this senseless animal. And I thought I was so righteous. And all the while, I was just choking myself on that 10-linked chain of the 10 commandments, violating the 10th commandment, just all wrapped up in covetousness and bitter envy, resentful envy. But then I went to worship with the people of God. And it was there that I realized how senseless it was. Because when I don't worship, you know what happens when I don't worship? I get this sense of entitlement that destroys gratitude. I become a less thankful, pleasant, positive person, grateful person. When I don't worship, I begin to envy people. When I don't worship, I begin to be negative and judgmental of other people. When I don't worship and I'm just looking at things through the microscope and making them into big deals, I find my heart is consumed with anxiety and fear. I get discouraged by setbacks, as though God isn't still with me, holding my hand, and that He'll never leave me or forsake me. You will worship. Everyone worships. You got to get your worship right, which is why God gave us as a gift this psalm and others. We need to worship the true and living God. It's in there that we find what we were made for. And so you can just hear the psalmist here saying, man, it's a good thing I went to church, man. My feet almost slipped. And I was circling the drain. It's a good thing that I went to the sanctuary, that I didn't avoid worship any longer. Man, had I would have continued in my bitter envy. I would have made some real stupid decisions, and that would have led me into sinful, destructive behavior. I would have moved through life joyless with this ungrateful heart. I would have spoken toxic, cynical words that undermined the confidence and faith of others. I would have continued to live blindly to the reality of God. But I was ambushed in worship in the best sense of the word. I put a quote in there by Dallas Willard for you to read under that point, but I just want to get to the last point here, and that is this. The third and most important observation about worship I already alluded to is that the best part of it is what it does for someone else. The best part of it is what it does for God. Did I give you all three? I did perspective. Did I give you the second fill in the blank? Because I know it drives some of you crazy. Diagnose my heart. Okay. And here it's about what it does for God. There's a Dallas Willard quote under this section too, but he talks about God isn't an egotist. God just, hey, worship and praise me. It's all about me. And it is, because he's God, it turns out. But is it like, oh, no, I'll stop it some more? Like he's just desperate to, for your crumbs of praise. And I love the quote here. He's saying, no, actually, God's quite content. And he says it like this. He says he's of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, three persons. He says, here there are magnificent beings, too one to be many and too many to be one. And he says that are just lost in the glory and the goodness of their life. And God, out of that goodness, he says, invites us to be a part of that. In fact, we were created for that. The Westminster Catechism, I'm going to go off the top of my head. I meant to look it up when I thought about it a couple days ago, but the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. He invites us into it. And the word is worship. The band can get ready to come back up. I mentioned last week I came in with some of the treasures that are in a box that I have. Silly things, and silver dollar my granddad gave me when I was 7. Somebody's garter from a wedding, I don't know, but I wished I did, because otherwise I'm just getting rid of that sucker. It's like I've had it for like 30 or 40 years. Just little trinkets that bring back some, except for the garter, bring back some memory for me. And I have another box. It's a box that contains more papers and pictures and actually I was looking through that the other day because Roger Swaggert's having the 80th birthday party, and we put it in the bulletins for those of you who know him to maybe send him some happy birthday wishes or some pictures or whatever from the past. And it was in there that I found like it was our very first church directory. This is like 1985, and then there's this picture here. No, go ahead. I found this picture. You got this next picture? No, not that one. That one. This was a newspaper article when I very first came, and that was from the local paper. And then I found the church directory from 85, and in it there was like, back then, I was new, and so I had to conform, and now I just write my own script, and so I don't do ties. But Frank, to your right, he's in heaven. Roger, he's 80 now, and these were the guys that were responsible for tricking me into coming here so long ago. And then, of course, this next picture was this is the church secretary. This was back when running off with the church secretary wouldn't have been scandalous. That was my wife. And I actually I found this picture. I led worship actually back in the day, but they thought it was going to my head a little bit, so they pulled the plug on that. But actually the thing that most moved me is this next little scrap of paper I found in the box from my youngest daughter, Hillary. She's left this for me when I came home from the office late. She says, "Dad, please come wake me up and snuggle Hillary." In case I didn't get the message, she added another one. She says, "Please come wake me up and snuggle. I made some room for you, please." Yeah. She was like my little sidekick. You think I'd take $10,000 for those pieces of paper? Bet your what? Life I would. I mean, I just have her, "Hey, can you make me another one of those pictures?" I'll spot you $100. You just draw that again. But now she's 29. And her idea of snuggling with her dad is altogether different. But she has her own little baby that she gets to snuggle with now. You know, I think when it comes to God, I think our problem is we often don't think of him as being a person. He's not a people, but he is a person. He's revealed himself to us as our Father in heaven. He's not a feelingless person. In fact, the scriptures tell us a lot about how he is grieved and about how he takes delight in some things and people and how he experiences anger and he knows to the depth that we'll never, ever know. You know, gut, heart-wrenching sorrow. You ever read the account in the Garden of Gethsemane? God knows, you know, infinite joy and infinite sorrow. And God knows more about these emotions, not less than we. He isn't like a computer. He's a person. And the best reason of all for worship is because it's a gift to our dad. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And if you want to know what God is like, and you want to know how worthy of worship he is, look at Jesus, who gave his life for us, who went to a cross and bore our sin upon himself. And there he suffered and died, and his lifeblood was poured out, and he was resurrected, and he's coming again. And that's the God that we worship. So let's, we're going to end with one more song where we'll do just that, and then I'll pray for us and dismiss us, and we'll also have some ushers come down, and if you are prepared to worship the Lord in that way, you can use those offering bags. If you're a guest, you could put that card in there. But let's turn let's get out our telescopes and let's magnify the Lord together in this final song.
Breathe
Father in heaven, we thank you so much for Jesus, and thank you for how he reveals the kind of God you are and the heart you have for your sheep. Thank you that you love us and that you hold our hand through all the trials and travails of life, and what a gift that is to have you. And I pray, God, you'd forgive us for looking to lesser things and treasuring those things instead of treasuring you. And I pray, God, you would give us just clarity this day and this week as we move into it, to know that worship isn't just something that we do as we gather, doesn't even just include music or song, but it really encompasses all of life, of our turning our hearts and our attention and our devotion to the only one who is worthy of it, and the only one who could bear the weight of our little souls that you love so dearly. So help us, we pray. I pray in Christ's name. God bless you guys. The Valentine's Banquet isn't just for couples, by the way, and you can sign up for that down in the lobby. Have a great week.